Hi, everybody. It is Thursday night, and it is another time for composers at home, maybe drinking coffee, and I'll bring myself in. There I am. And there's my name, Elliot Miles McKinley. I'm your host for tonight's episode, and I'm going to fade out this lovely music I've got going on in the background, which is Drum Kern, I'm Old Fashioned, a lovely tune performed by my father. And I'll talk more about that later. But I hope everybody's doing okay. It's really an honor and a privilege to have one of my I wouldn't say oldest friends, but definitely in the older category of friends on with me tonight, my friend Derek Bermel. So I'm really excited to catch up with Derek, and we'll talk to him and find out what's going on and talk a little bit about his musical journey and share some music and hopefully field some questions. If you're tuning in, please feel free to ask questions anytime. Please say hello to us. We always like to know that somebody's watching. And let us know how you're doing, and please comment. You know, like I said, ask questions. I will be looking over to this side, those of you who have seen my show before, to see the questions when I see them pop in over here. If you're new to the show, I will do my ubiquitous social media plug. Please like us on the Facebook page, like and subscribe over on the YouTube page, depending on which page you're tuning in on, and always appreciate it. Comment on the videos that will be archived after the shows. All the show's videos are archived on both the Facebook page and also over on YouTube. So if you missed any of our previous episodes with our composers, they're there for on-demand streaming. Isn't technology wonderful for that sort of thing? Anyway, all right, so I've talked enough. I'm going to bring in my friend Derek. And there is Derek. Hey, Derek, how you doing, man?
Cheers.
Cheers, yeah. So that's a perfect segue to my Composers at Home Maybe Drinking Coffee mug. Derek doesn't have one of those yet. We'll have to hook you up with one of those mugs. You have I
tried to order one on Amazon, but that's pretty much what the shopping is like around here now. No, this is the Brooklyn Bridge. Actually, you can see kind of.
There we go. Got it. Yeah.
Full 360. Yeah.
Nice. So is it warm in New York now? It's warm up here in Boston. It's like steamy and muggy, the usual heat.
Yeah, whatever you got there, it's going to be a little worse here.
Right, slightly worse in New York. Right.
Yeah.
You know, I usually ask the composers that come on the show at least this once, and it's impossible to not address this at least a little bit in the context of our current environment. But without going too far into it, you know, how have you been dealing with this whole sort of strange new world that we're in the COVID planet, which we didn't grow up sort of expecting this to happen at some point. I mean, even though scientists warned us about it, but that's another story.
Yeah, it should be the same story, but
right.
You know, it's interesting that it takes me back a long way to time that I spent in Ghana, which was around the time that we knew each other.
Yeah.
Maybe shortly before. I had probably just come back from Ghana.
Yeah.
And you know, in those places, where you still have quite rampant contagious disease,
yeah,
and infectious disease, people think about this kind of stuff a lot, and we're
it's more present. Yeah,
I mean, we're operating from a place of privilege here, where malaria has been eradicated. things like dysentery are rare, and cholera has mostly been eradicated.
Right, right.
But that wasn't the case, 100 years ago here.
Right. People got polio on a very regular basis. This was a normal kind of like, life lottery type of situation. Right? Up until the 50s.
And I just remember, you'd go somewhere, say you'd go to visit someone in a village. I was in a village in the northwest of Ghana at that time, and you'd go to someone's house and they would offer you water. Now that water could be life-ending, actually, or certainly very dangerous to drink. But you were always faced with the question of, how do I interact with people on a day-to-day level when my life could be hanging in the balance, or my health? And
like every meal, right?
Yeah, well, just a lot of interactions. You'd be sitting outside, there'd be mosquitoes all over the place, and
that's right. Right. The malaria.
If these flies, or there'd be flies all over you, you think, well, these flies could be carrying cholera or some other airborne, some other communicable disease. These mosquitoes may have malaria, and in fact, I got malaria when I was there, and I got dysentery while I was there, and neither one was pleasant.
Right. No one.
But this is something that a lot of people in the world are dealing with
on a much
basis.
Right. Than we in the Western worlds have largely skated past those kinds of issues, for better or worse, and we don't think about it, and then it comes to inconvenience our life, and suddenly we can't, people get pissed off when they can't get toilet paper, and it's like, dude, I mean, it's funny you mentioned that. And first of all, we'll talk about Ghana also, but from a musical point of view, and also I have a little story about the first time I met you, which actually revolves around that. But that's later. But I tell my students this on a more regular basis than not. When they piss and moan about various things, which we all do. We all sort of piss and moan about our first world issues. But then, at some point, I'm usually reminded to tell them that, by the way, you have the miracle, and it is a minor miracle, but it's a miracle nonetheless, of being able to have on-demand potable water. You just turn a knob and water happens, and it's not going to kill you, like you said. It's like, you don't realize what miracle that is, or that when you go to the bathroom, you don't have to deal with it. You press a button and walk away. Wash your hands with the potable water, and you walk away. It just it doesn't. You and I both know it doesn't go away, but for the person in the house or in the building, it pretty much is. It's forgotten. They don't have to deal with it. They don't have to take it anywhere. They don't have to bury it. So, it's a very good reminder, and I think travel, and in your case, travel to a place that doesn't necessarily have all of the modern conveniences that we do, is important to do, because it puts a lot of other things in perspective. When we get so myopic about, oh man, I only have 3G now. Like, this is really terrible. Like, I can't, how can I watch those YouTube videos now? Like, my life is now over, right? Or explain to a kid who's so used to Wi-Fi that suddenly they have, like, there's no Wi-Fi now, and it's like, that's the end of the world. And so, so circling back to COVID, for you, this is just kind of, in some ways, just makes you recall that time when you were with a population that more or less had to deal with something potentially really bad every day.
Well, there's just a slower rhythm, so that you could, if you wanted to we're used to getting 5, 6 things done in a day at least. And
Yeah, right.
I suppose I went over there to study the xylophone actually. And when I would be in these small villages, I'd say, okay, I'm gonna get these 5 things done today. No,
Right.
you'll be lucky if you get one thing
right?
done.
Yeah, right.
But along the way, I mean, it's not about the actual. It's not. What I found was so fascinating and very rich about being there was that it wasn't about the achieving of tasks as much as it was about the journey
Right.
to achieve those tasks. That on the way something
Right.
interesting would happen,
Right.
and
Right.
I might have a kind of a change of my point of view would shift, and I would learn something new because I'd be seeing the same thing from a different perspective.
Right.
My perspective would shift, and
Right.
so that allowing myself to slow down and to have lower expectations about how much could be achieved in a day, but having higher expectations of what I would achieve along the way
Yeah.
for each of those tasks
Right.
was actually illuminating. And it was a real change of perspective and rhythm from what I was used to here.
Right.
In America, where we're always measuring how much we can accomplish.
Right. Go, go, go. Do. Right. I want to loop back into that in a little bit, because I want to talk about maybe in the number of ways that experience influenced and changed perhaps the way that you thought about composition and music going forward, because it was an experience, of course, that was incredibly rich and changing for you. But before we go there, for the people who are watching who may not know much about you, or perhaps maybe read a bio, there's a lot more to you than just a bio. And so can you take us back to, again, something I ask a lot of composers when they come on the show, take us back to some of your first experiences with music, and what, maybe not just composition, because we can talk about the composition part, but just music itself, and what were some of your earliest musical experiences and influences?
Well, I think I started doing music when I was very young. I don't remember this, but my mom would tell me that when I was 1 or 2, I would pick out tunes at the piano, and I loved to sing when I was very little. And my house was kind of a theatrical house and a literary house. My dad was a writer. He was a playwright, a translator, a teacher. My mom had studied theater, and she was a very good singer. Actually, she used to sing around the house a lot. Actually, she would make up tunes for just about everything. So if she was making coffee, for example, she would say,
Wow.
"I'm making the coffee. I'm making the coffee." She started making a tune about it.
Cool.
That was just her way, I guess, of passing the time. Or maybe it's something to do with having kids. You start making a song.
Just start doing, yeah, right.
But I do have memories of that, and so like I said, it was kind of a literary household of words and of theater. My dad was also working as a critic for a while, and so he would go to shows many nights. He wrote a lot about theater, about French theater, especially like. And he wrote about farce. He wrote a textbook on farce. So I used to go down with him to the village, and we'd see Greenwich Village.
Yeah.
And we'd see like 8-hour shows of Chaplin and Keaton and Keystone Cops and Mae West and it kind of early farcical silent films, and I would love that, and my dad would be taking notes, but I would just be enjoying
just the spectacle. Right. It's fun for kids, that stuff. Right.
So and I probably saw every Shakespeare play at least once during high school and before. So and a lot of French theater. So I guess I came with an interest in comedy and farcical kinds of timing.
Uh-huh.
I was
Yeah.
very interested in timing and theatrical timing. Um, but musically, I was a musical kid, so I was an ear kid, not so much an eye kid. I wouldn't notice what was going on around me, but I was noticing sounds. And I like to imitate sounds, and I started playing the clarinet when I was 7, and then I started playing jazz piano mostly when I heard Thelonious Monk for the first time. I used to buy records with my allowance, and most of the time I'd buy Beatles records. I loved Beatles when I was a kid. I loved songs, and then I would. But one time I went into the record store. It was Paul's Record Hut. So I grew up in New York, and then we moved to New Rochelle. My dad was teaching in the Bronx at Lehman College, and there was a record store called Paul's Record Hut, and I would go there with my allowance, and I would save up to buy a record every couple of weeks. So then I remember there was a record in the bargain bin. It was like $1.99, and I saw this picture of a man playing piano. He was sweating. He looked really intense, like he was concentrating. He had a hat on. Yeah. And I thought, I don't know who this is, but this guy looks like
I gotta check it out.
Yeah. And it was Thelonious Monk. It's Monk's Time was the name of the album.
Okay, yeah.
And I went home and listened to that, and it just blew my mind, and it blew my whole sensibility about what music could be. Yeah. And I started right around that time. My grandmother had bought me a beat up piano. She bought it from one of our relatives, and we had this barely playable piano in the house, but it kind of worked, you know. And I would play it, and I would just imitate Monk. And actually, Monk's kind of sounded good on that kind of piano. And it was, and so I would just imitate everything I heard, all those incredible harmonically rich tunes. And I would still say today that Monk is probably the biggest harmonic influence on my music. But then I played clarinet, and so of course I played the standards, Mozart, Brahms. But I was very interested in new music, and I started getting into composers. I go to the library and take out records constantly, and I took out Bartok, took out the complete works of Webern. I remember I brought that home. My parents were
Was that the Boulez edition or some earlier edition?
Yeah, Robert Kraft.
The Kraft. Okay, yeah.
I mean, at that time, you know. Yeah. And so I was just absorbing tons of stuff, and of course, tons of pop music, gospel music. There were a lot of kids in my elementary school who would go to church. I'd stay over at their house, and the church, they sang gospel music, you know, and I learned a lot about gospel music in an African American tradition. But then of course, the Jackson 5 and the Commodores and all the funk, like George Clinton, and then hip hop came in when I was in junior high. And so you had all this stuff. It was all going on in New York. It was like
it was like an epicenter of all of this stuff.
So you had the Sugar Hill Gang from Harlem. You had Boogie Down Productions from the Bronx, and there was a kind of rivalry between them and different styles, and everybody was. So what was interesting to me was, after learning about Charlie Parker playing saxophone, learning about Charlie Parker practicing that stuff, trying to play that stuff as fast as I could, you know. Then suddenly came Rakim and these rappers who were doing the same thing with hip hop that Parker had done with rhythm, to break down rhythm, to kind of move over the bar line.
So it wasn't so square. Yeah.
So it was an exciting time to be making music and being creative and playing music with friends. I played in bands. I played in an orchestra, youth orchestra. I wrote orchestra music. I wrote chamber music for my friends. And that was the kind of, I just try to make my own way. Right.
So when you're so you're here, you are just basically sponging music of all kinds, right? The ears are open to all possible sonic experiences, right? But what? So you already mentioned you started writing music, for orchestra, chamber music for your friends, etc. Was there any beyond your, say, clarinet lessons? Did you have any early composition teaching, or somebody sort of looking at your music and saying, "Hey, man, you might want to, pick up this, check out, the range of this instrument or whatever"? I mean, just like the real nuts and bolts, or were you just like having at it before you went into any kind of like structured composition lessons?
Well, I had this when I was 11 or 12. I was in camp, and for some reason it was a music camp, and so someone put on the program a work by Olivier Messiaen, which was called 20 regards sur l'enfant Jésus, 20 views of the infant Jesus. And I heard two movements of this huge piano cycle written by Messiaen, a great French composer. And this was when Messiaen was alive, of course. And I just thought, oh, I don't know who that guy is, but whatever he does, that's what I want to do. And he was a composer. So
that you just made that connection, right? Like, oh, well, this is,
And that's when I started going to the library and getting these albums out and trying to find out what this was, and learning about Stravinsky and Hindemith and the whole kind of European tradition. And then the Americans learning, listening to Copland, listening to, and of course playing Copland Concerto, which I played in high school.
So at what point did you think that maybe you wanted to pursue this as a career, or maybe not even career, but just like really take it to the next level? Like you're doing a lot of this on your own. You answered a question that I would answer is like, what was there a piece that sort of like hit you? Well, it was the Messiaen. That was like the piece that sort of said, oh, maybe I want to do this, right? So like what was your thought process there as a precocious teen, going into music? I mean, even if it wasn't composition, even if it was something else.
I just followed whatever I loved to do. I mean, there were a few people along the way that came into the story. I suppose I think about when I was a kid, I had just started the clarinet, and John Corleano's Clarinet Concerto was premiered by the New York Philharmonic. Right. And because my dad taught at Lehman College, he knew John a little bit. He had interacted with him. And he said to me, let's go down and see this composition by John Corleano. So I didn't know. I went with him. And I heard Stanley Drucker play this with the New York Philharmonic. And it was just extraordinary. And I loved it. And it was really inspirational. And my dad saw John that week at some point in the hall at Lehman College and said, oh, John, my son, I took my son to see your piece. He's 8 years old or something, 9 years old, and he loved it. And he just got a big kick out of hearing your clarinet concerto. Yeah. And the next day in my dad's box was a clarinet part to John's concerto. Oh, wow. Which I still have today.
That's awesome. Yeah.
So, it was that kind of thing felt very generous to me. And I never forgot that somebody who I considered, great composer, living composer.
This guy's probably thinking, you're probably thinking, who am I? Just some kid, right? Why,
Well, I was a kid, so I thought I was important. But now
there's that. Okay, but in hindsight, though, actually,
an 8-year-old kid the clarinet.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But I also had another experience which was less than stellar, where my parents took me to a composer who was teaching at that time in Manhattan School of Music, and I talk about this on my blog. I have a blog where I relate some old stories and try to draw some inferences from them. But But they took me along with an orchestra piece that I had prodigiously written at age 15.
Mm-hmm.
And I brought it to this guy who lived not too far from us. And he got the piece, he looked at it, he said, "This is terrible. This is really square. It's not going anywhere. You need to learn about John Cage." And
Wow.
I said,
not the first name that popped into my head, but okay. I mean,
well, he said, I said, "Isn't that the guy who wrote the piece that had no notes?" Because I didn't know very much, but I knew a little bit about John Cage,
right,
because
yeah.
I had taken the albums out and I knew about Cage.
Right.
And he said, "John Cage is a genius. You need to study." And he starts bringing out all these scores and showing me the piano concerto with the notes hanging off the clef. And I was just like, I don't want to do this. I don't like this.
Like, this is
this has no melody, So
right.
I didn't appreciate that, of course, but they brought me to the wrong person. Let's put it that way.
Sure. Yeah. I mean,
he wasn't the right guy to teach a 14-year-old.
Right.
How to,
yeah.
interested.
And that's kind of interesting. I might touch on that later if we talk about teaching a little bit, but a mark, I think, and maybe you can corroborate this. A mark of a good teacher is being able to assess. Yeah, he might have just loved Cage, whatever, fine. But a good teacher is to assess the situation. I mean, here you are, 15 years old, writing an orchestra piece. Now, there aren't that many 15-year-olds that write orchestra music. So that's cool. I mean, that's just like, he should be looking at it, I think, with a bit more of a, I guess, a broad lens, not necessarily expecting you to like come in, having written Lutoslawski's Third Symphony or something, right? So, and then approach that like, oh, hey, this is, instead of saying it's square, tell you why he thinks it's square, in a way that you might understand at 15, maybe using some language that perhaps, you could have understood, like whatever. But I don't know this. I'm not going to, ask names or whatever, but it's just my reaction is that if I kids show me music all the time. I mean, even, and I'm always aware of kind of immediately where they're at. And so the first thing I'm going to do is not start pulling Stravinsky scores off my shelf and start saying, you got to know this, right? If this person doesn't really, it's so out of, it's like, it's so out of context. But anyway, be that as it may, like you said, maybe the wrong person, not necessarily a bad person, but the wrong person for you at that time, right? So, and those are good lessons to learn. And I was thinking about the Corigliano story when you mentioned that, the generosity part, which I think you've carried and your whole life. That has been kind of a mark, and you've been very generous to your colleagues and to other people. And that's part of your personality, but maybe also just sort of realizing that somebody like John Corigliano could take a moment to give a clarinet part to someone he doesn't know and probably would never think to know later, right? Like, he didn't know whether or not you'd ever become a composer or a clarinetist of any note or anything. You could have, gone in a completely different career and never heard from again, right? So there's that point of generosity, and that where I think that's a good lesson to learn, even as 8-9-year-old, I think looking back on that. And then the other thing is the story you just relayed, which is how maybe not to react in a situation whenever, let's say, a 15-year-old comes to you now and shows you a score. And maybe you might think in your head, oh, this is square, for whatever reasons you might think, right? You're gonna check yourself you're gonna go, okay, wait a minute, I remember, right? So I don't know. I'm just sort of saying that these are formative kinds of things that I think helped shape you. What is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything things happen for a reason at a specific time, and I suppose probably at that time the most important thing for me was just to keep absorbing
Right.
music.
Yeah.
And I think I've found throughout my life that I like to keep learning, and and part of that is transmitting, because you do learn by teaching. Sometimes
Right.
you learn to analyze things that you might not have analyzed, and sometimes watching another person's way of learning is also instructive.
Right. Right. Right.
Uh, I don't know, I've taught mostly in my own self-created opportunities, by starting programs here and there, uh, but certainly now I teach in the summers at Bowdoin, and
Yeah.
it's hard to teach during the year while you're playing and writing. It's a
Right.
lot.
Right.
I end up with ACO doing a lot of mentoring.
You do your teaching in other ways rather than sort of within the walls of the university, which I may ask you about later, because again, life is full of different kinds of ways of directions, right? And your direction.
I'm switching cups, by the way. I'm switching to the Bohemian coffee shop
Okay.
in Brunswick, Maine.
Nice. Speaking of Bowdoin, so, all right. So, when did you decide to go in your undergrad? Let's talk about your undergrad. So, you go into college, and what was your undergrad experience like?
Well, I was at Yale, and as an undergrad at that time, I think now they've merged the undergrad with the grad program a lot more, and which I think is a good thing, because I was a little astray. I wasn't sure. I was studying physics. I was studying math, and I was doing anthropology and French and all these things, which was great because I was learning a lot about a lot of different things. The value of a liberal arts education.
Right.
But in terms of music, because I was a clarinetist, I just assumed I was going to be in the orchestra, and I had a raw awakening because my freshman year I tried out for the orchestra and I didn't get in. And for me, that was a huge blow because I had never faced that kind of rejection before as a clarinetist.
Yeah.
I was like a little virtuoso guy. And then suddenly I got to the big leagues and I didn't get in.
You realize, right.
So I had to decide what to do with myself musically. And I had friends who were advising me to try out for an a cappella group. Now, I didn't sing at all except in a band in high school pretty badly. But I thought, well, let me try this out. So I tried out for a couple groups. I was just winging it. Yeah. And one of them took me. And it was an all-male singing group. And so I spent 4 years learning about singing. And so my entire musical trajectory shifted because of this missed opportunity, which became a new opportunity. And so I think I learned something from that, just about the nature of opportunity, that sometimes, not to get all Beyonce on you, but you take what you got and you go.
Yeah, so exactly.
I found a way to turn that into a transformative experience, and one that actually informed my composing in subsequent years. Yeah,
absolutely. You're what were some of let me ask this question. Maybe this is a good question to ask at this time in your life. As you pointed out, you have many musical influences coming into your brain. You're absorbing it. You've been absorbing all of this stuff for many years, playing and doing your own writing, and now here you are in college. Was there a point where, or a piece, let's say, where you felt that all of that stuff that's been mixing around in your musical library had filtered out to become you, like where you felt you wrote a piece, because and I'm going to say this, like, a lot of us when we composers, when we are first writing, we tend to write a lot of music, and that music tends to sound a lot like what we're listening to. It's kind of a way of learning. You learn through, you're not trying to write a piece that sounds maybe like Stravinsky or Ravel, but if you have it, but it's hard for that stuff not to come out in early efforts. Was there a piece you can remember that, like, you were like, hey, you know, that's kind of me, like that might have a lot of influences that I have absorbed that I clearly want to retain, but yet there's something in me and my own, what I want to say is coming out?
Yeah, I wrote actually wrote a blog post about this also. There's when I was in, sorry if you can hear the sirens behind me.
It's fine. We're live, so, you know, UPS came to the door during one of my interviews about it, so, you know, it happens.
Oh. Well, yeah, when I had a teacher, you know, I had been writing music since a young age, and so I had mostly been redoing my favorites, Messiaen, Bartok. You mentioned Stravinsky, of course. There's a lot of that. And when I was in Israel, I was studying with a composer named Andre Haidu, and he was an ethnomusicologist and also taught me orchestration really seriously, like every week, orchestrating two pieces in the style of a different composer, that kind of thing. It was really hardcore, and I learned a great deal from him. He himself was a student of Kodály and traveled around Hungary with Kodály for 10 years, collecting folk songs and cataloging. So he was a great composer, great educator, and unfortunately passed away about 4 years ago. But Andre was my teacher there, and he was the first teacher who really got on me about the fact that I wasn't really trying to write my own thing. He kept saying to me, "You're writing someone else's music. You're writing someone else's music." And so I asked him, "Well, how do I write my own music?" He said, "Go to a room and sit in the dark with no distractions around you, and stay there until you hear something that is all your own." So maybe in a way that was a Cagean kind of experiment.
Right, the white room with the chair, right, yeah.
The chamber, where you can't hear. But he was asking me to try to come to in a way, into a spiritual place of isolation,
right,
and of thought, and of profundity, rather than just kind of continuing to translate what I was just getting from all these sources that from which that I was listening to. So I did that, and it took me a while to come up with something. He said, strip it down, just write piano music, just take the most neutral kind of instrument. Right. Sorry to the pianist, but that, as a composer, the piano has a neutrality about it. And I did, and so my first real composition, which was a tiny short piano piece that later I called a funk study, but that piece was really the first piece I think that had my own sound to it, which of course is never really your own.
Right.
We don't make it.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
We're just bringing it from somewhere, but it came from deep inside me. It was the first piece that I felt I was speaking with my own voice in a more in a more deliberate way and
Yeah.
careful way.
Yeah.
And so that was a jumping off point for me. And I think from there, that language just started to evolve.
Yeah. Yeah. That's an interesting kind of exercise to prescribe. And actually, I when you mentioned your blog post, I actually, when you relayed that story, I was like, oh yeah, I read that blog post, and I was like, oh yeah, that's right, I remember that, because I remember that he telling you to go and basically isolate yourself, and find yourself through that process, and
it was hard to find a quiet room because Israelis can be kind of loud.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And what we do, and this is maybe for the benefit of those who are watching who might not be composers, or maybe dabbling in composition in maybe just beginning or something like this. That process is invaluable to the composer in every decision and choice we make. And what I mean by that is when I teach composition, and when I think about composition, when I'm doing it myself, my process is I always ask myself, does it need to be there? Every decision, every musical decision I make, what note, dynamic, whatever it is, rhythm, does it need to be there? Does it have to be there? And if it doesn't have to be there, then I don't do it. I mean, that's kind of that's that process of distillation, right? To find basically what it is that you actually are trying to say. And it requires, and Derek, maybe you can speak to this, it requires a lot of discipline and honesty because it's when you've done this long enough, it's easy to write a lot of music that isn't yours. That will sound pretty good. People will go, oh, that's pretty good. I mean, I think I could churn out hours of music that's pretty good, but it's not me, right? That's the real thing, is to find that. And that's why I don't churn out hours and hours and hours of music. I'm not saying that being prolific is a bad thing, because some people are very prolific and have that down, like they can really get that down. But yeah, that experience that you had, I think was, correct me if I'm wrong, was something that now you carry forward. You always remember that when you're writing a piece of music, even subliminally, you're thinking of that room, you're thinking of that space, right? Start a new piece, or even in the middle of a piece when you get stuck, whatever it might be.
Well, the composers that I admire a lot are the ones who, and this is true for writers that I read too. And artists, painters, or other visual artists, choreographers, are those who set out to almost examine the question of, why am I doing this?
Right.
In every piece they do, so that a composer like Ligeti, you often feel when you listen to the music, or at least I feel that every time he writes a piece, he asks himself that question: why am I writing music?
Yeah,
what's the point of this piece? And why write music at all? And I guess I'd like to think that I emulate that at least sometimes.
Yeah.
I mean, Duke Ellington is the same.
Sure.
That I feel that there's that kind of inquisitiveness and critic. You mentioned that you have to be self-critical, that you have to be, and it's true, really, we're our own best editors. Nobody can edit us better than ourselves, but we have to be honest with ourselves about whether it's working or not, and then listen to that little bugbear who's
just constantly talking. Yeah, right. Yeah, absolutely. But all the composers, performers, players that we tend to admire are those who often ask those questions of themselves honestly and execute that. Miles says, "Don't tell me what you're going to play, tell me what you're not going to play." That's another way of saying what we're saying. And I actually have a Bill Baulkham story. We haven't gotten up to talk about Michigan yet, but I think we both probably have a lot of funny Bill stories. But mine isn't a lesson, actually. And, we need to be reminded of this every now and then, of this very thing. And so my little Bill story about this subject is I brought in a piece to Bill. So Derek, by the way, for those of you in the audience who don't know, Derek and I both went to the University of Michigan for our advanced studies. I went there for master's, and Derek, you held on for your doctorate. You were there for your DMA, right? Yeah. So we both worked.
Not that I ever used it.
Yeah, well, we're going to talk about that, your life choices, right? But we both worked with William Baulkham, and so I had a lesson with Bill, and brought in a piece of music, and I was very happy, to bring in a finished piece of music, and Bill looked at it. I don't know, Bill probably just got back from being on tour or something like that. He looked pretty tired. We went and got coffee first and then came back anyway. So Bill thumbed through it and went to the piano. We both went to the piano and kind of plunked out a few things, and he asked a couple little questions, and then he handed it back to me. And here I was. I wanted to get the pat on the back from this man I admired and was studying with, right? And Bill said to me, he goes, he said, and the exact words were a little bit better than this, but he said basically, he goes, Elliot, you can write an awful lot of really nice music. Now, at first I thought that was a compliment, right? So I walked out and I felt pretty good about myself. And then I started reflecting on it. And it bugged me all week till the next lesson. And I knew what Bill was trying to tell me. He was telling me that I could write a lot of nice music, but it wasn't my music. Like, he could see through it. That was kind of his little message to me. And later he revealed that was basically what he was thinking. The piece was fine, but it just wasn't. It wasn't anything that was original or unique. Even if I thought at that time I was trying to say what I thought I was trying to say. So even then. After writing a lot of music, one can still have those little gut check moments of, oops, I took my eye off the ball. Or maybe I wasn't, maybe I shut the critic off for some reason or whatever, right? I wasn't paying attention. So composers out there, it's a lifelong process. It never stops. Anyway, so that sort of rolls us a bit up to Michigan, right? So after Yale, you headed off to U of M. What drew you to Michigan?
Well, actually, after Yale, so I went to Israel. I worked with undergrad.
So you did that, right?
Spent a year and a half teaching kids who at that time, the term at that time was emotionally disturbed. Nobody would use that term now. You'd say, you would say, with particular challenges. But anyway, so I taught there, and I was teaching music to these kids, and a lot of them had dealt with a lot of trauma in their life. So many of them had been taken away from their home by the state. And so, you'd see sometimes on the holidays really who had it the worst. Like you'd see kids there on Thanksgiving staying at this place. sometimes I would take kids home and spend Thanksgiving with them.
Right. Yeah.
23 or something. So I would bring a few kids home, have a turkey or something. But that was a different kind of experience. And of course, trying to relate to music in a very different way. And I suddenly ended up going right from Israel to run the gospel choir at this place, which was kind of a little bit ironic, let's say.
Right.
At least be ironic. But anyway, there were things that I learned a lot about teaching, and then I headed over to Michigan after that, and I was lucky enough to get in there because it was one of the one of the places I really wanted to go. And work with some great composers, William Albright, and Bill Baulkham, of course, and just learn from a lot of the faculty there who were really wonderful. Martin Katz and George Shirley, and, Bob Reynolds and Gustav Meyer. There were a lot of really wonderful people on the faculty that I learned a great deal from. Not even just in music too, in some of the other schools.
It's a top school with a lot of energy. I remember going there from Boston and just being, even though it's, I wouldn't call Ann Arbor a sleepy town, but it is a college town, and it's not that
it is
far
compared to Brooklyn.
Yeah, right. But still, there's a lot of energy going on, right? It's a very, especially during the school year, there's an awful lot going on, and I'm not just talking about on football Saturday. And the School of Music, very dynamic place, right? So we both were in that environment.
And I played a couple of pieces of yours.
That's right. Yeah. Well, actually, that kind of I remember my first composition. Actually, I think it might have been the first composition seminar, or was a meeting of the composers at the beginning of the year. And you had just come back from Ghana. And I think it was the other Bill Albright, was unfortunately is not with us anymore. But Bill, I think, said, he introduced you to like the whole. I forget if it was just the incoming students or if it was a combination. It was a composition get together. It was in one of those rooms. But I have this vision of you on the floor playing the xylophone, sitting there. I think improvising or playing a tune. I don't know. You were doing something. You played for about 5 or 6 minutes, and my first reaction is, well, who is this guy? Who's this guy coming out of nowhere? But then, I asked somebody next to me, and I said, is he a grad student or whatever, or like a doctoral student or whatever? I think at the time you were still masters. You're just finishing up masters. Was that between your first and second year master? I can't remember when you went to what.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. And it became pretty clear. Everyone I ever talked to, before I even talked to you directly, said, you got to know Derek. That was the first thing out of people's mouths. You have to know. You got to. Have you met Derek yet? That was sort of like the thing that went around. Have you talked to Derek? I was thinking. I was trying to get some people together to play a piece, actually. And have you met Derek? I'm sure Derek will know people. And that's actually you were conductor for a couple pieces of mine. And for some, I don't know, you said yes to everything. So people who might know Derek now will know that Derek said back then was pretty much like, oh, hey, this is great, I'll do it. And whether it was a concerto or a new piece or conducting or whatever it was, you were always willing to help. And when I was trying to find players, you opened up your book and you're like, oh yeah, here are phone numbers, and it was like suddenly I had 15 violin players to call. It's like yeah. So
well, that's because I got an orchestra piece of mine together while I was there.
Right.
Gave everybody pizza. I offered everybody pizza.
Right.
And the conductor of the orchestra told me, oh no one will ever no one will say yes. Don't do that. Don't even try to do that. But people did. I mean,
Yeah.
pizza is like a pretty big deal.
It
Free
is.
pizza,
Free food. The musicians and free food is kind of like that's the magic sauce right there. You know.
So I got an 80-person orchestra together to do it.
Yeah.
I still keep it with some of those musicians.
Yeah. So yeah, and then then I found out you were a great clarinet player, and that was history, because then I was like, oh, okay, I'll write you a piece, and you were like, oh yeah, I'll write you. So how your experience in Ann Arbor? I mean, without getting too far in the weeds on that, what can you name a one or two sort of experiences that you had in Ann Arbor that were impactful to you, beyond the vibrancy of the school and the classes and studying with these great people?
Well, yeah, I mean, it was interacting with colleagues. That was the strongest thing. Of course, it was great to have lessons with Bill, and so many, got to know the composition faculty was wonderful. Leslie Bassett, Michael Dougherty, all those people were around, but really interacting with some really wonderful musicians who were there at the same time, like Gerald Cleaver and Craig Taborn, and my friend Timothy Jones, who I still work with now, and Christopher Taylor, who I met while I was there. And there were I made a lot of lifelong friendships.
Right.
Dave Rogers, Mark Stone, a lot of musicians who are now spread across the country and some around the world, who I learned from. I learned about performing, and I learned about their instrument from them, and so it was just a growing process. But I found Ann Arbor. I mean, I was glad to get out of Ann Arbor in a way, because I loved the town. It's a cute town, and it was a great kind of laboratory environment. But when I went the next year to Amsterdam, I really found a very different kind of vibrancy. From being around a very different group of composers and musicians. So yeah, I think that I made composer friends that I'm still close with today from Michigan, and I'm very grateful for that. And I mean, there's a whole bunch of them. You can probably name them right off.
Right. There's a Venn diagram there.
Yeah, it was a really, really good, wonderful time. And but I think it's everywhere you go, you just take what the lessons that you can from that group of people. And the time in Amsterdam was vibrant in a very different way, and I just tried to keep absorbing as much music as I can, as I could at that time.
How long did you spend in Amsterdam?
I was there about a year and a half, and it was an interesting years, because I was studying with Andriessen, Louis Andriessen, and then I would go over to France and take lessons with Dutilleux, who I had met at Tanglewood the summer before. So they were very, very different type of musicians and very different type of teachers. Dutilleux was very hands off, and that year was full of surprises, because I met a lot of European composers, a lot of composers from Asia, South America, who were doing very different kinds of things. And so I was introduced to all kinds of music that I didn't know before in concert. And I think I kept a log, and I went to more than 150 concerts that year.
Wow.
I used to sneak into the Concertgebouw, which is very near the street that I was living on, which was a market street called the Albert Kuipstraat. And I would take my tux, and I would walk in to the back door, the stage
Like
door,
the stage,
of the concerto
as you,
house,
as
and I would wave to them, and
like
I
as a
brought
musician, like,
clarinet
hey.
case. Yeah, they would wave to me, and I'd walk in, and then I'd go in the back.
That's awesome.
And so I got in free. And then one time there was a solo pianist playing, and I forgot who. And in fact, it was the Messiaen Catalogue d'Oiseau. There was a Russian pianist named Anatol Ugorsky who was playing the whole Catalogue d'Oiseau, which is huge. 4 hours.
Yeah.
And I brought my tux. I had my
clarinet.
I waved to the guy at the kind of, and he waves back, and then he
kind of like,
program.
wait a minute.
And I thought, oh shit! And so I just ran in and made a line, and I kind of got lost in the crowd.
Yeah. That's funny. It's like you need to make sure that, is there a clarinet playing tonight, just to see if you could be legit, right? Yeah, that's
but
funny.
I saw amazing music there. I saw the Stockhausen Gruppen. I saw, I just saw so much incredible music that you never
see here. Yeah, you would never. I'm just to that point, because as you were mentioning that, I was thinking about. So now we don't have to. I'm not trying to make this a bio, because let's play some music soon, talk about music, but I'm curious now. Your in all of the years you've been involved in music and living here in the States, and of course all your travel abroad, there kind of is this Europe and America, I don't want to say divide, it's not the right word for it, but there's definitely a kind of different feeling and different programming that goes on in Europe in the new music scene than here. Like you said, I don't know when I've ever even seen Gruppen programmed by a major American orchestra, or some even like some kind of major new music ensemble or something, getting a pickup band together to try to do something like that. I don't know, maybe I'm sure it has been done, but it's not. But in Europe, it's like something that I wouldn't think twice about. Oh, a Gruppen, sure, that's cool, it's on the program. But it's like I wouldn't think twice about it being programmed. So, can you speak?
You're not going to see it anytime soon, that's for sure.
Well, yeah, right. For three virtual orchestras, three Garriton personal orchestras.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, Europe, there's a lot of funding, a lot of money for the arts, but I would also say, that I learned a great deal in other continents besides Europe or America or North America. Because South America, I learned a tremendous amount in Brazil about music and from the composers there, some really interesting composers in Brazil and Argentina and Venezuela, and Mexico, and Cuba. And so then in Asia, some incredible music out of Korea and Japan and India, so it's kind of like there's a Europe-America axis in terms of new music, but then the bigger world is really interesting. Once you get into African music,
it's a whole different
exploring. And all that is just we're lucky to be living in an era where we can travel. Because say 150 years ago, it would have been tough to go to some of those places. You may not come back if you went.
Right.
And now, in a way, it's interesting because it's almost too easy to step into the virtual realm, and then you can see anything on YouTube. So why go anywhere? And during the pandemic,
that's interesting because now that equation has been actually put to the fore. Where now that's really the only way to do it. It's before it was the convenience of it. Do I want to get dressed and go to a concert? Oh no, I can watch it on YouTube. But now we get to do this and shows like this, which I never imagined doing. But you mentioned all the other music that's going on in the world, and not just. I mentioned the Europe America thing only because you mentioned the programming in Amsterdam, but of course, like you said, you know, there's a whole different kind of scene in South America, in Africa, in China, Japan, Korea. I mean, there's stuff that's going on in Russia that we don't hear about too. I mean, Central Asia, the Middle East, Iran. There are some great Iranian composers that we don't hear about because, you know, we don't have that's not open, you know, in terms of like getting the music back and forth, right? So, but then you mentioned it being really easy, and it is easy, and I think this is one of those sort of like potential traps to fall into about ease of access and whether or not that has a desensitizing factor, in that it's kind of like, oh yeah, great, there's some great South American music on, okay, well, I'll watch it later. Or, I mean, you know, I'm not saying that happens, but if there is such a thing as information overload, right? And also noise too. You know, trying to like, you know, it's like filter through the noise, because there's a lot of things happening, and there are a lot of people vying for attention. And there's only so much attention that's you know, being focused, and that's not that also begs the question about like how we in our limited lifetimes are able to make choices to explore and synthesize, because it's like to really absorb the music from the whole world and do it in a way that would do it justice, would take more than one lifetime, would probably take 1,000,000 lifetimes, right? So it's kind of like, how do we make those choices?
Well, you know, it's part of it is just about the way in which you aim to learn about one thing.
Right.
So I've always felt that getting the context is very important, because we see everything now through a screen. On YouTube, it's incredible. You can hear music from all around the world, from every tradition, from every, you can even hear some things you probably shouldn't hear that are probably sacred things that you're not supposed to hear in that environment. But somebody
uploaded on YouTube, right? Yeah.
Yeah, we can watch all kinds of things. We're watching people suffocate and die at the hands of police. I mean, we're seeing a lot of stuff. There's a lot of information out there that is, it's almost, as you said, it's almost desensitizing, the amount. Yeah. But the question is, what does it mean to actually be in the space? And of course, right now with coronavirus, we're up against the fact that we are not in that space. Right. We are not in those spaces. We're at home in a virtual space, and we're exploring things without their context. And there's a flattening, flattening effect, which is deleterious in some ways, but also possibly offers other things.
There are other opportunities. Yeah, right.
But I mean, I do think that there is this danger of being overstimulated with the surface of things and understimulated with the depth, many levels of things, and the profundity of one thing that you could study very deeply and learn something very elemental about. Yeah. And I think that's the temptation that as artists we have to resist, learning so little about everything that we don't really get the funk underneath it, the thing that's animating it, the multidimensionalness of it. And it would be better to learn one thing well, than to learn 6 things
like very surface. Yeah, absolutely. And then it comes down to like what do you choose, right? What are the choices with all of the menu of options, you know? Right.
That's your instincts that lead that. You have to decide that by what you're passionate about, and what you love should lead you. That's something that Thieu actually used to say. He used to say, "On ne peut pas tout aimer." You can't love everything. You know, there has to be something that you really love. And those
Yeah.
are the things that hopefully as artists, the things we love are the things we will delve into, and we will
Right.
try to reach those layers. And
Right.
out of that, filtered through our own sensibility, comes our own voice, which is what we
We were
started with.
talking about earlier. Yeah, exactly. So speaking of voice, why don't we play some music? Let's cue up maybe your orchestra piece, first orchestra piece that I have, and I will call up the score here pretty soon. A shout, a whisper, and a trace. Do you want to set this up before we play it in any way?
Okay, I will. But which movement are you going to play? You're going to play at the beginning?
Maybe. Well, do you have a particular movement you'd like? Because I can cue up the first movement, which is America. I'm not going to say it. Is that Polish?
Yeah. That's actually Hungarian.
Okay. Okay.
The piece is a tribute to Bela Bartok, and actually a tribute. It's based on the letters that he wrote home from New York after he emigrated to the U.S. And I think he felt he would come back to Hungary, but he didn't live long enough to do that. He lived in the U.S. He emigrated in 1940
Yeah.
on a boat from Europe, obviously because things were getting very bad in Budapest, and he had to get out.
Yeah.
And so he came through Lisbon and came to New York and was utterly befuddled by New York.
Yeah.
But spent the last 5 years of his life kind of moving around New York in different contexts. Not a very happy
No.
last 5 years when he had leukemia and was getting worse.
Yeah. And
but he wrote some beautiful letters home, and so on those letters I based
these pieces.
Yeah.
I think maybe the third movement. I have the third movement ready to go.
Okay.
So
yeah, the third movement are the kind of ghosts that are walking around New York. So I thought of all the ghosts that have been here. And I can say that this piece, I was asked many times to write a New York kind of piece because I'm from New York, you know, but I could never really figure out what to write until I read these letters of Bartok. And I was reading the letters of somebody who was seeing New York through
this lens.
eyes.
Yeah.
The eyes of an immigrant. And I thought, wow, this is an interesting way to see New York. And suddenly it came alive for me in this different way. So so the third movement, the first two movements have more to do with Bartok's life. The third movement is the kind of ghosts that are inhabiting the streets of New York, walking around.
Wow, cool. All right, so let's take a listen to that. I'll switch over to the music view here for everybody. So we will meet up after we hear this movement. Wow, man, that was great. So that was 2009. So I'll ask composers this question. How do you feel about this piece now, 11 years later? Not like just in general. I mean, that's a tough question, but.
Well, I mean, I remember reading Tchaikovsky's letters. He was talking about Tchaikovsky Fifth Symphony, and he said, "All I hear are the seas."
Uh-huh.
When I hear my own music, I hear my struggle writing it, or I hear decisions I made.
Right.
And so I'm not sure that I have the best experience listening to my own music.
Yeah.
That hopefully other people have. I remember that when I started writing that piece, I started thinking, oh, this sounds like Philip Glass or something. And I think the reason was because it was working with very simple scales. And I thought, wow, this is the first piece of mine that I could imagine has any influence from Philip Glass.
Kind of like thinking that did you think that was not an influence that you thought would come out in any music piece? Was that why it was surprising, or was it just because it took this long for Philip Glass to, I guess, through osmosis, filter into your language?
I don't know that he did. It's just I mean, I've actually played with Philip the early pieces, at his place with various musicians, like the music in Similar Motion, which I like a lot. I know the music in 12 parts. The early, from the first, say, 10 years with his own ensemble, it was just incredible stuff.
Yeah.
But I mean, I don't know that anyone else would hear that. I can hear the thing
because you're on the inside, right?
Yeah. And I don't necessarily think that it sounds like his music. It's just that when I hear it, I remember when I was writing that at the piano, and I was thinking, oh, this sounds, but to me, it sounded in my inner ear, like my own version of Philip Glass, which isn't Philip Glass.
Sure, of course.
Was my own transformation.
Your take on it, right.
Yeah, I don't even know, but it's something about it made me think of his music, and I think it was the kind of simplicity of lines crossing and ostinati, but like I said, I don't think that my own reactions to my own music bear that much.
Right. Or in other words, your mileage may vary in terms of how much you should really listen to Derek about his own music.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, certainly, to me, and I look this way because this is where the score is, and Derek, you can't see this, but basically the audience can see essentially a PDF projection of your score, and then we have two little talking heads in the corner, and I will actually look for some questions. Hopefully, maybe we have some questions or comments from the viewers. But one thing that strikes me, and I remember listening to some of your earlier orchestra music, is your sense of orchestration's just very spot on. Your choices of color are really tasty, and I can kind of feel, again, this is not your mileage may vary listening to me talking about your music, but I can also feel that sort of just delicate, almost touching film noir quality in this movement. Like you said, ghosts, and I can sort of see these sort of dark streets, wet streets kind of thing, right? Just visual, like if I had to draw a visual aspect, and then you have these, like you said, these scalar sort of contrary scalar things, and very very, very clear, and very evocative of that kind of mysterious, almost foggy type of feeling. Now, of course, I only visit New York to go see concerts and eat at great restaurants. So that's my experience with New York. You live there, so and maybe we'll get this we'll get this question out of the way. The question of sort of programmatic music, maybe externalized representational music to that of the internal. And you can field this question any way you want. You can field it philosophically, you can field it craft-wise, or you can field it also in relative to this piece or to this movement in particular. But the notion of how much of New York, in a sense, or your experience of New York, is in this musical portrayal. And I asked this of Eric Stem last week, who has a project where he's writing orchestra pieces about different cities. Like, he goes to different locations, and so he has a piece called Portland, which is about Portland, Oregon, and he spent a lot of time there. He's not from Portland, but he goes to these different places and he writes these pieces. And I asked him the question, I said, well, are you trying to do a kind of a musical picture of the place, or is it some internal expressionistic sort of view? So I guess I'll throw that for you to answer any way you'd like to answer, and I'll also look for some questions.
Well, New York, I mean, reflecting on New York is a little like reflecting on my own music, because being from here,
right,
means that that I don't have the greatest perspective on it, but I think, for me, I'm not out to do anything really narrative, but just that there's a kind of a mood.
Yeah.
And so when I think about the piece, I think more about the construct of the piece. There are some metric modulations that happen that move it along at a certain pace. Mm-hmm. And I thought a lot about the pacing of the movement, so mm-hmm. that it stays at a certain pace and in a certain harmonic realm for a mm-hmm. while. Mm-hmm. And then it starts to change harmony and change pace at a faster and faster rate, right, until you reach this more climactic moment, where both the movement of the harmonic rhythm and the energy of the orchestration mm-hmm. is at its highest point. And so there's something about the arc of the movement in that,
right?
And then that's based on those scales. So there are two different scales that are happening, one within the melodic line and mm-hmm. one within this kind of undulation and the scales that move from top to bottom as the piece mm-hmm. Goes on. So right. I think a lot about counterpoint.
Sure. Sure. So in other words,
a linear guy. I'm a clarinet player, so
right. You see one line, right? And of course, if you said your introduction to harmony was Monk, and so you're really dealing with more or less three lines and counterpoint sometimes. Usually you're gonna have two notes for the chord and one for the usually, not all the time, but you know what I'm talking about. Monk is very sparse.
Monk is interesting. Yeah, well,
he picks the right notes though. He gets all the really right notes. I mean,
the right wrong notes.
The right wrong notes, but they're right. You know what I mean? They swing. So I guess you answer the question from a point of view that you're in addition to the asking the question of must it be there, your compositional craft, it's impossible for that not to be in play. So in other words, you took this idea and you made music out of it. but that idea was sort of based on some, I guess, if you will, some flavor that you were trying to evoke, if for lack of anything else better to say.
Yeah, and I try to let it go where it's going to go. I mean, I don't want to control that. It starts with a certain kind of mood, but I don't necessarily want to control that mood.
Right,
I want that
right.
mood to go where it's going to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because it might go in a direction that it might go in a totally different kind of emotional direction.
Right.
But as it is, it went where it went.
Right. Actually, that's interesting because we'll play another piece. I actually want to play a piece of you. I think it's the clarinet quintet. Maybe next. That'll be a good contrast. But first of all, let me go to the viewer comments because we had a bunch of comments come in during the piece. So we had so Bruce Lazarus, excellent interview.
That's on you.
Huh? Oh well, hey man, no. Hey, look, the interviewee is that's. Okay, Anthony Joseph Landman, Tony, who's been on the show and he's a great composer. He says, "Wow, awesome, and what an amazing recording." And this was Albany, right?
Albany Symphony. Yeah.
David Post says, "Really like the way you build and layer on layer. And then Tony again says, your orchestration is amazing. Question now, how much practical experience did you have with orchestras before you wrote this piece? We did touch upon, some of your very early stuff, including like the one in Michigan, for example, but the one with the 15-year-old, but then of course the one that you at Michigan, which actually the one at Michigan was, is that Dust Dances?
The one I was talking about was even before Dust Dances.
Oh, okay. You did a second, because I remember that one, Dust Dances, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, so,
Well, I mean, Dust Dances was my fourth orchestra piece, and it's the first one that I will let anybody hear.
Okay, good.
It takes a long time to learn about how to orchestrate. My first orchestra piece, I wrote the strings at the top. I mean, I didn't know how to. I had no instruction, so I was just going off the top of my head. And for some reason, I had looked at a number of scores, but I never bothered to look at the order in which the instruments were written. Right. So when I was in high school, I was learning. I was just doing it on my own. Yeah. And then I think that Dust Dances. Well, I worked on another piece before that, which I, as I mentioned, and it was a terrible piece. This piece that I got all the students together to read, it was awful. It was cacophony. I had an idea about trying to make the orchestra sound like a big drum set, so kind of like boom, ka boom, boom, ka boom, boom, doing these kind of things. It was terrible. It sounded awful. It sounded awful.
This was before.
Horrendous.
Yeah, for the kids in the audience, this is way before FL Studio. This is right. No. Yeah.
I had these ideas about clusters of sound and but it sounded good. All I had at that point were MIDI recordings, so I didn't know what my music sounded like with live musicians, and that was really the great gift for me at University of Michigan, was really learning how that interfaced with the reality of the orchestra. But this is probably about my 12th orchestra piece, I would say, like somewhere around there. And I've been lucky enough to have a lot of orchestras play my music over the years, which is the best way to learn, but also by revising, because I think that I've learned a lot by picking up the pen again after the piece is done and saying, okay, some things need to change. And I've done that with just about every one of my compositions. After the premiere, I go about revising. I'm a big reviser. And I think that it's an ongoing process of learning from different performances honing, because at
Right.
some point we're all going to kick the bucket, and the only thing left is going to be the score
That's
and
it.
whatever recordings there might be. But that's it, really. And recently I saw that there were about 3,000 changes in the new edition of Bartok's Concerto for Orchestra.
Wow.
So
So go figure,
the,
right?
the
Yeah.
I mean, the biggest thing with orchestration was the chance to work with Andre Haydn, 2 pieces a week
Yeah.
in the style of
Yeah.
Haydn, and then the next
Yeah.
week in the style of
Yeah.
Mozart, and the next week in
Yeah.
the style of Schubert, and the
Right.
next week the style
Right.
of Brahms. And it was
Right.
just drilling so that I knew the look of the score
Yeah.
as well as the sound.
So that's really interesting that you bring that up, because when the look of the score is actually not unimportant. That's not an unimportant detail. And I'm not talking about, like you said, like where the strings go. I'm talking about like how the music appears visually on the page can be an important learning experience. And the process of copying out music, even if it's just copying, like copying lines, just copying out like the first violin part to a whatever, that's invaluable. That sort of iterative process of just going through, and I sometimes, if a composer comes to me and I'm teaching a composer that really wants to learn, I say, well, if you really want to learn this, if you want to learn how to write for bassoon or whatever, let's go grab a score, anything by Stravinsky, and just write the whole damn thing out. Just write the whole bassoon line and sing them. Sing it. Don't just do it mechanically to make it look good. Sing the lines as you're writing them out. And but so few people do that. Take that, and the way that you learned was really an old school. That's an old school way of doing it. My pop also did the same thing. And when he would give assignments to students, it'd be like, okay, now I want you, like next week, I want you to come in. This is going to be, I want you to have this orchestrated like Schumann, and then the next week, like you said, every week, it's like, and it's not fooling around. It's like really getting into it, really getting into the sound world, and getting into the way that the gestures look on the page, getting to the way that the density is on the page, getting into the way that the instruments are being combined, and how they're blending, and all of this stuff. It's so invaluable to actually do that work.
Yeah, because for composers, orchestration is it's another element of your language, and so it's wrapped up in your musical voice. And the way that Debussy will orchestrate a C chord is really different than the way Schoenberg will orchestrate a C chord.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Not that he would often orchestrate a C chord, or Debussy for that matter. But there is something to be said for if I would often tell a student when I teach, as you were saying about copying over a passage of music, and I've done this many times myself, is that there's a passage, say in a Ravel piece, and I want to be able to make that sound. Then I learn directly from Ravel, meaning that if I'm copying that score, one page,
just whatever,
not the whole score, because that's a task it's too gargantuan. You'll never do it.
Yeah.
But if you say, I'm going to copy these 2 pages of this Ravel score, then you are learning directly from Ravel. Ravel is your teacher. So I can bypass Dutilleux, even he's a great orchestrator himself, and I can go right to Ravel and say, I'm going to learn from Ravel. And you can't do much better than having Ravel as your teacher.
No,
and it
that's
was
source study.
as Gershwin found out anyway, to have Ravel as your teacher.
Right, exactly.
But still, I think that it bears repeating that copying orchestral music or
chamber music, piano music, whatever. Exactly. I found myself
go to the source. Go to the source.
Yeah.
Do that imitation, because it's the same way you learn how to, like when I was playing Charlie Parker, trying to play like Charlie Parker. the same way, if you want to learn to write like Ravel, you go right to the source and
Yep.
you copy.
Absolutely, absolutely. And if you don't have a score, I mean, if you're dealing with, for example, like Charlie Parker solos or whatever, there's no score available or whatever, transcription. You know, get your recording and just, you know, that the best ear training ever is transcription. I mean, it's like you can do all the ear training books you want and learn all the solfege you want, and that's great. But if you really, 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 really want to test your ears, you know, put on, I don't know, man, listen to, you know, some of the second quintet records by Miles and try to transcribe some of those tunes that Wayne wrote and learn what Herbie's voicings are. Right? And that is an app right there. Just Herbie Hancock's piano voicings is a lesson in voice leading and orchestration and piano, you know, right there. And so it's like whether you have the score and you copy out a bassoon part, or you don't have music that has a score associated with it, maybe just a lead sheet. You want to learn, you got to go to the source, you know, and no better teacher than the source, like you said, Ravel or Herbie or whatever, Coltrane, whatever it might be. Other questions we have? Beautiful listening experience, Deborah Madsen. Let's listen to another piece. Speaking of which, so you have you're playing clarinet on this next piece.
Which piece is this?
This is the quintet.
Oh, okay, clarinet quintet. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, this is a piece that was inspired by lectures by the great physicist Nima Arkani Hamed, and I was lucky enough to be at the Institute for Advanced Study for 4 years, so I got to hang out. This is a place in Princeton, which is a kind of a think tank with a lot of philosophers and scientists and mathematicians, and Nima is somebody who's thought a lot about the very large and the very small. He's a string theorist, but he's an incredibly charismatic speaker, and I went to a number of his lectures, and I was very inspired by his way of giving narrative to questions about the fundamental laws of the universe. And so I wrote this piece, and it has 3 movements, and they're all based on some aspect that Nima articulated in his. So are you playing, which movement are you playing?
We're gonna do blah 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 blah. We're gonna do I think it's the multiverse movement, actually, is the one that you sent me.
That's movement 1.
Movement 1, yep.
And that was just a lecture that he did on multiverse. And so here I suppose there are 3 different kinds of rhythmic tracks, rhythmic areas of activity, and a lot of it is centered around glissandi. I was lucky enough to write for the Jack Quartet, so we were touring this piece, and it was a lot of fun to travel around with those guys. And this is from an upcoming recording that should be out next year.
Very cool. All right, man. So let's.
So the title of the piece is A Short History of the Universe as Related by Nima Arkani Hamed. And the movement is multiverse. So this is the multiverse movement. So you'll hear various levels of the multiverse operating at different speeds.
Very cool.
Or you'll hear something else.
Right. Like we said earlier, take what Derek has to say about his own music with a grain of salt, right? Right. Yeah, right. Okay. All right. We'll switch over to the score view here, and we'll meet up after we hear this movement. Wow, man. That was cool. That was very cool. I wanted to ask you about your. Anybody who doesn't know that Derek mentioned this earlier, he's not just a clarinet player that sort of dabbles on the side. He's a really great player. You can hear it here. And so I want to ask you how, we'll talk about the music and get some questions, but I'm just curious about how you balance your practicing and you're sort of keeping your chops up at a level that you can play your own music and execute and play other people's music. You've played a lot of different music, new and old music, and yet also still have time in the day to compose. I mean, do you find that balance between your keeping your chops up at a professional level as a player, and also, doing what you need to do compositionally? Is that a challenge, or have you found a pretty good balance, or does it change?
Oh, have I found a balance? No.
Yeah. Okay. That's a good, fair enough.
No.
Yeah.
No, and what suffers is the clarinet playing, because
Yeah.
I would, if there are a lot of things I would love to do as a clarinetist if I had the time and the space, or if I was making the time and space to do them, but
Yeah.
I just don't. So, so I do what I can as a clarinetist, and I love to play. I love to read music with people, make music with people, and I play with the Copland House. I play as a soloist, but I certainly don't ever have any time to do orchestral playing. So the last time I played in an orchestra really was in high school, because as I told you, at Yale, they didn't take me. So, and that was it. That was the end. So, but obviously many times I played as a soloist with orchestras, and but for the most part, I love making chamber music with people. It just keeps me in touch with the tactileness of music, and there's just so many musicians I love playing with and just being with. So for me, that's pleasure. But no, I don't get to do it enough.
Yeah, right. It's that balance. There've been many composers in history, of course, who have had tremendous careers, often as pianists. We know of many such examples where they're concertizing pianists and also composers as well. And maybe in some ways, although certainly not exclusively, the piano is usually kind of an instrument that sort of falls within the domain of the composer. Most often people associate the piano with the composer, not necessarily the clarinet. To the point that you made about the tactileness, and this is another thing that I tell students, is that if you really want to be a complete musician, play something and do something on a performative aspect, even if it's not for a paying audience or you're trying to play your own music or whatever, just to stay engaged as a performer on some level, or executing something, because there's something in performing that is, I think, vital in helping inform the compositional process too. I mean, it's a feedback loop, right? And even if you never play a note of your own music, there's still that feedback loop. Can you speak to that? I mean, how is your clarinet playing, besides writing music for yourself to play, how is your clarinet playing and being a performer helped at all or informed your music?
Well, when I wrote my clarinet concerto, which was 20 years ago, a little more than 20 years ago, it was really out of a necessity, a compositional necessity. Because I had this idea about sounds. Some of them you even heard in that piece just now, the clarinet quintet. These sounds that are come out of speaking and that are free flowing. But when I wanted to use those kinds of sounds, I couldn't figure out how to make an orchestra sound like this dialogue. I was particularly influenced by this recording. One of my favorite clarinet players is Eric Dolphy, a great big clarinet player. Yeah. And I have a recording of Dolphy and Mingus from about 1959, 1960, where they're playing this tune called "What Love," which is actually what is this thing they call love?
Yeah,
But,
yeah.
but it's kind of with the middle taken out and smashed together, the beginning and end.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the middle, they're just doing this free improvisation. And I thought, wow, I would love to do that for orchestra. It sounds like speaking.
Yeah, yeah.
And but I couldn't figure out how to get the orchestra to do the things. I was notating certain things, but I was trying to develop a system of notation that would allow me to show the orchestra how to do those things. And it was proving difficult. But then when I decided, it suddenly occurred to me that if I actually played the clarinet like that,
you could get
they
what you
would
want.
hear that, and immediately they would understand what the notation was trying to tell them.
Right.
So that's where notation kind of mixes with the oral tradition, and where notation is not something that is absolute. It's relative to the learning and to the player's own sense of their own musicianship and their own experience with notation. So in a way, notation is a guide, it's a start.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
Between the notation and the music that's made, there is this leap that has to be made by the performer, which is the exciting thing as a composer, that the performer is that link to what eventually we hear
will be the sound,
but there is that unknown space in the middle between notation. The notation can never be the performance, and I think it's one of the real problems of the 20th century is this desire for notation to almost become the music. Right. And it can never be the music. It's only a guide to where to go, to how to get to the music. Yeah. So as specific as you can get, it always ends up there. And so for me, the clarinet concerto, that was the key, was the soloist leading the orchestra through this and making the notation more explicable right away. Because for an orchestra, to one of the questions that came through before, one of the main things is how can an orchestra quickly understand and digest and then realize what it is that you've written down, especially when you're trying to write something that's difficult and that maybe hasn't been done much in the orchestra. Yeah,
I think, that's a big subject, is the subject you brought up about notation too, is this, it's a kind of, I don't know if it's the right word is inherit. We inherited this sort of tradition of notation that's really only a few hundred years old. I mean, in terms of the notation we know today, but notation goes back about 1,000 years. But it was never very Western notation. That is, it was never really intended to be a kind of at least originally as a kind of perfect representation of the music. It was just it was a guide to learn. It was actually like, this is how to learn the tune that I'm teaching you. This is a guide to write it down so that we can remember. Oh yeah, right. That's how it goes. And so then we get to like you said, the 20th century, and all of these attempts to try to make the score like a sonogram almost. And it's not, it never quite will be. And as composers, and I know you know this, I know this, anyone who's a composer out there knows this, you're constantly wrestling with the system, to get the system to do your bidding so that you can make it clear to the performer what it is that you were really intending. And then hopefully you've put enough instruction down that the performer, if the performer is good and will ask the right questions, the performer will come to create the sound that you imagined. Or the performer may bring some new perspective as a performer that you hadn't thought of, which is also really beautiful whenever a performer says, oh, have you thought about this? And then you're like, oh, wow, no, I didn't. That's awesome. How do I write that? Many times, you know this, we've both been in rehearsal and suddenly we're like, okay, let's change that because that sounds better. let's go and see if we have any comments here. I'll switch over screens. Let's see. Oh, we have a bunch. Tony and Landman again, very cool. Andrew D'Angelo is a fantastic sax player and composer. Says great piece, Derek. Do you know Andrew?
I don't know him. No. But glad to know about him. I know Tony Landman. Yeah, terrific.
Let's see. We have so Tony said that actually makes me feel better. Oh, Tony's speaking about the balance of the life balance there between performer and composer. So that actually makes me feel better about myself that you can't find a balance between composing and performing, because I can't either. So, yeah. I think you mentioned it earlier, and it was in reference to music. All the music that we have, and all of the things in the world that one could be interested in, not just music, but all of the things that you could explore in a lifetime. You can't love them all. So you have to pick a couple things and go with that. It's sort of like the hobby thing. Like I love reading and I love astronomy and I love, it's like a million things that I love to do, and I run out of hours in the day. You got to find some time to sleep, and I enjoy that too.
That's very true.
You get a little older and you really dig sleep, So we have David Gaines, Dolphy, good choice. Yes, Dolphy is good choice. David also said that's one nutty piece of music, but he in a good way. He's talking about probably all the glissandos was really cool. Yeah. So those lectures must have been really cool to attend. What, were they?
Nima.
Yeah. Sorry. Was he focusing it? Did he focus those lectures for those in the room who may not understand the underpinnings of theoretical or astrophysical things, or were they for colleagues? I mean, were you in there thinking, "Oh shit, I don't have the math for this," or was it?
Well,
yeah.
What was interesting about the Institute was, I had some elementary physics background, and I always enjoyed reading about and learning about physics and mathematics, especially about astrophysics. When I was at college, I was studying, superstring theory, which was quite new at the time. It felt like an explosion of ideas, and it was loaded with possibilities, almost on a kind of psychological, spiritual level.
Right.
Felt like there were a lot of possibilities there that could be mined even artistically, inspirationally, and so I read a lot about it, and in a way it's almost the same kind of explosion of thought that we had when Einstein said that that relativity redefined the way we thought about the world and the universe around us.
Time is not finite.
When Newton came out with, it's a revolution of thinking about where we place ourselves in the universe. Like when Copernicus said the sun doesn't revolve around us. So it's a way of changing your placement in the universe and your perspective. And I love the fact that Nima's a lot of his talks focus on changing one's perspective about how we see and feel the universe. And I think that has direct ramifications on music and art.
I want to loop back to your time in Ghana, talk about changing perspectives, and maybe this is a way of sort of connecting some points here. And before we talk about that, those of you watching have any other questions or comments for Derek, please type them in. Where I joke often at these shows where I'm not trying to, I don't have advertisers, so it's not like we have to go immediately or anything, but I also don't want to keep you all night because I'm sure you've got the practicing and composing to do. So, so yeah, please, before we let Derek go, let's please ask questions about anything. It can be about astrophysics too. That's cool. You and I have a love of that subject as well. So your time in Ghana, how has that, and I hate to sort of frame it in such a very quasi stupid way, but how has that experience now almost 30 years, 25, 26 years later, 27, 20, 28. Jesus, I'm losing track of time, man. How has that framed your life choices and trajectory and your art? Not just specifically about what you absorbed in learning the xylophone and in African musical traditions that you had a first-hand experience with, but just, how you think about music and art. And this can also tie into some of the other things that you've dealt with in your career as an artist.
Well, what I came back from Ghana feeling after having been there for 4 months, which may sound to some people like a long time to spend in a village, with no electricity, no running water,
right?
No phones, nothing like that. So, but at the same time, it felt very short when I got back because I felt that I had hardly learned anything.
Right.
And so that I think what I learned from that experience was just that there's so much to learn about so many things.
Right.
And that those kind of precious moments are when one's perspective is changed, when you have a kind of epiphany, when you learn something through sheer hard work, that a change comes into your consciousness from that work, which can't be replicated by just listening to a lot of stuff. But the work was what made it valuable and powerful. And so I had to allow myself the humility to say, well, I will never know very much about this. I only barely scratched the surface. And that all kinds of traditions like that
everywhere
there are levels and layers of depth. And so and the other thing that I recognized being there was that most of my teachers there were farmers. They would come home from working in the fields. They were farming what they called ground nuts, which we would call peanuts, or they had the guinea fowl there, and they had various plants that aren't like anything we have here. But the main point was that they would be coming back from the farm and playing the xylophone. So when I would interact with them was after they had been already working for the whole day.
Right.
And the xylophone was a form of recreation.
Yes.
And also kind of a spiritual exercise and activity. And so that there was ritual associated with the xylophone, there was ritual music, and there was kind of recreational music, but all these were happening separately from what they did to make money and earn a living and subsist. Right. And so I always try to remember that, because even though we make music into a career, it's on some level it's an avocation. It's something that we just love to do, and to try to continue to find that love. And when it becomes too much of a job, to allow yourself to be led by again, by what you love,
Right.
and not be just seduced into taking a commission because you're getting paid, or taking a job because you're
Right.
getting paid, but
Right.
to really delve into what it is you have to say truly as an artist and a human being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because we just have this life and that's it, and if we're
Right.
just using
So
our music
I,
to make
I was
money,
gonna say, yeah, time is finite, and one of my sayings about that is that we only get a fixed number of trips on the rock, around fixed number of little orbits, right? We don't know how many we get. That's the variable. So we need to make the best out of what we've got in terms of the time, because we don't know when the next lap is going to be our last. And I like, to your point, the moment that the art becomes, I guess, I don't want to say that it becomes too much of a job, but the moment like where it becomes like you just have to crank it out because because you need the check or something, is kind of like a moment where you sort of step back and say, well, what am I doing here? Like, first of all, and I tell this to students, there are a lot of other really better ways to make money, and a lot more money than this. So there's that. And so if you can make money doing something else, and a lot more of it, go for it. But you can still write music, right? Like you said, the farmers, they work all day, and that's not easy work, man. Like, that's not easy work to do all day long, and then you come and you make music because because you love it, or it's a, like you said, spiritual practice or something. And I think for us as composers and artists, we do it also. This is kind of our church. I see composing as kind of I'm not very religious. I'm not religious at all, actually. I'm kind of a-religious, but that's another subject. So like for me, my creativity is sort of like my way of connecting with something that might not be me, or like me, but sort of on another thing, right? And so I don't want that to have to be called into like, well, I got to slap the double bar down because I'm going to write that next Pepsi commercial. It's going to get me the, whatever. So yeah, I hear you on that, and that's important for all people to sort of take into that perspective of finite time and choices too. What do you do with your time? Andrew said, I'd be curious to hear how your notation software plays back your piece, how it interprets specific notation. I think that's probably the first movement of the clarinet quintet. Let me ask you the question. I think I'm going to saddle Andrew's question. Just one thing about notation, and this, we've seen young composers do this all the time. Well, the MIDI plays it back like this, right? And how many times young composers will fall into the trap of writing to the software? And because the software puts them into a space to be able to, and it sounds like maybe they can get what they want, and it sounds really cool in the software, right? But it's not going to translate necessarily to a live situation. And I think maybe not for you so much as a composer, although you can speak to that, but what do you tell young composers who are working with software like Finale or Sibelius or now Dorico or MuseScore, whatever it might be? How do you tell them to get past the limitations of what you're hearing in the MIDI, even if the MIDI is really good and some of these sound libraries are amazing?
Well, I guess it depends what they're doing, and how they relate to the computer as a tool. I mean, all these things are tools. Pencils are tools, computers are tools.
Right.
Our ears are tools in a way.
Yeah.
But I mean, if I think about a piece like the Clarinet Quintet, for example, I mean, you can't render that on a computer.
Right.
So the most I could get by listening to MIDI, say, is just a sense of pacing. And I think MIDI might be good for looking at the pacing of a piece, just to say, well, is this going at about the right pace? Does it get here at the right time? But beyond that, I don't find much value in it as a substitute for a live performance. So I can't really rely on it for much else besides, say, pitch, like a piano sound to get pitch, and I don't find it very useful. And even for pacing, it can also be so mechanical that it can't replicate the pace as a piece moves. But I suppose, just there is some value in being a listener to your own music, so that as long as it doesn't become a crutch, I think you can have MIDI going and sit there and take it in as it comes to you, and say, maybe that this whole event happens too soon, or needs something else before this. But it's that I think of MIDI in a very general way. In that regard, and I don't trust it very much.
I learned not to trust MIDI a long time ago. And I think if there are any last little questions. Oh, wait a minute. Andrew said, exactly. So many young folks send me these MIDI files and they want me to play it that way, which is funny but cool. As a performer, you get the MIDI file, and then if you don't play it the way, it's that kind of like expectations. Play it like the MIDI, right? How come you can't play those 64th notes, man? And
well, look, I mean, Ligeti in the last piano etudes, he said this piece will not be playable until the year. I forget what he
put
said.
Some year,
playable for 25 years, and then the next year, Pierre Lorimer, he recorded it. So it's it was a challenge in a way, but I think these are things that they're just, in a way, it can challenge the player.
Sure.
To do things. So that could be fun.
There's right.
It's just a tool. It's a tool.
It's just that tool. Right. Before I let you go, you mentioned pacing, and you've mentioned pacing several times, and so we'll use this as our closing the closing argument, if you will. And I'll have you back on. I plan to actually have everybody back on for like a where are they now, like maybe in about 6 months. So we'll see what's going on. But it was Lansing McCloskey and I when he was on the show, and we talked a lot about composition pedagogy, and we talked about how you can teach a lot to a young composer, but there's one thing you can't teach, and there's no text really that can teach you pacing, and how one gets to understand one's own sense of form that way. And you mentioned, of course, the MIDI is a tool. It can be used, that you can have a playback, if you will, of whatever it is that you put in. I'll walk with the piece sometimes. I'll conduct it in my mind or imagine it, and sort of, for me, it's important to imagine the physical gestures when I write, so I sort of see the gesture almost as I'm composing. So I think the question I'm going to ask is, how do you, and beyond the MIDI, beyond, say, maybe just listening it back and saying that's too short, that's too long, or whatever, what are some of the ways that you approach your pacing? Like, look, what are some of the compositional tools in your toolbox do you tend to use for your pacing out your ideas?
Well, there's that old joke. I'm not even sure we can accomplish it on Zoom, but it's ask me what the most important part of telling a joke is. No, ask me.
What is the most important part of telling a joke? Yeah, timing, right. Yeah, right. You did
But
it.
that
You
can be
did it. Yeah.
fooled in a number of ways. So ask me
Yeah.
again.
What is the most important part of telling a joke?
Timing.
Right.
So, I mean,
Yeah.
well, you get back to theater and
Yeah.
and what does it mean to interrupt and to respond and to find pacing, and that's a very personal kind of thing, and it depends what effect you want from that. And form is the highest level of composition. So when we're really studying Mahler or Sibelius or Meredith Monk
Right.
or you know
Right.
anything, a big Ellington suite, we're looking at form, of a great opera like Botzek. We're looking at the pacing and the form and how things are organized, how time is organized, because time is our medium,
Right.
and we
Right.
have to work within that medium. So that, to me, it's the highest form, how we use harmony to move through a large scale form and to save certain kinds of harmonic motion. And I think I read a quote of Esa-Pekka Salonen recently where he said that think of the greatest moments in music, and 9 times out of 10, it's a harmonic arrival, which is signaling that moment,
Big
which
change,
is why that moment is so important.
Yeah.
So harmony is integrally tied, and counterpoint is integrally tied to form.
Yeah.
And we see that in Bach all the way through history. So this is the highest level. This is the hardest part to deal with, is timing and pacing. And, I think it's a nice place to end this discussion on, because I think it's the toughest thing that we have. This is our toughest nut to crack.
It's a lifetime of learning and trial and error and a lot of work in the process. So we will close with that. Derek, man, thank you so much for coming on the show tonight and spending some time with us. I'll have you back for maybe a little coffee break follow-up at some point in the near future. But I will post, for those watching a replay, I will post some links to Derek's website and some other things. So if you want to check out more music or find out where to get the music, that sort of thing, we'll make that available in the comment section in the next day or so after this is over. So Derek, with that, thank you so much, man. I really appreciate it. And now switching to next week, I'm going to bring on the placard for next week, and we're going to have David Post. And it's actually not going to be next week. It's going to be at the end of this month on July 30th. My friend David will join me, and this might be pending social distancing and COVID and all that stuff. This very well may be a first for composers at home, maybe drinking coffee, and that he may join us live in studio. And I put the studio in quotes because it's really at my home. So that might happen. It may still be by Zoom, but it also may be, it might be in person. So who knows? I might actually have somebody sitting next to me. In the meantime, I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of the night. For those of you who are watching live, and those of you who are watching the replay, I hope that you are having a wonderful day or evening or morning. Please like, comment, subscribe. If you have any questions for myself or for Derek post-show, please put them into the comments. We'll try to get to them, try to filter and send them to Derek. And if there's some specific questions about any of the music or anything that he's been up to, and until next week, or I shouldn't say next week, till the end of the month, please stay safe, practice responsible social distancing, and we'll see you later. Bye-bye.